The shadow in the attic. Emily never wanted to set foot in that house. Bathed in shadow at the edge of a nearly forgotten town, the mansion loomed like a silent predator, watching, waiting. It was hers only by default, an inheritance from a family she barely knew, a crumbling relic tethered to whispers of the past. As her car's tires crunched over the gravel driveway, she stared up at the house, its windows black with emptiness, its walls groaning under the weight of time. She told herself it was temporary, a pit stop to sort through the wreckage of her family's legacy. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in the haunting glow of twilight, Emily had a feeling she wouldn't be leaving as quickly as she'd hoped. Inside was worse. The air was stale, thick with neglect. Dust shrouded the peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked like an old man's bones. Her footsteps echoed as if the house had been expecting her, its silence broken only by the faint groan of wood above her, the attic. That first night, the house felt unnervingly alive. In the suffocating quiet, Emily struggled to sleep, her ears attuned to every creak and groan. Then it came, the sound that pulled her heart into her throat. A muffled thud above her, followed by the faintest scrape of movement. She froze, locking her eyes on the ceiling. The attic. She hadn't even been up there yet. Pulling the blanket tighter around her, Emily told herself it was the wind, the house settling, nothing more. But as the night dragged on, the noises persisted. Slow, deliberate steps, the faint rustle of something shifting, and the unmistakable sensation that someone or something was watching. By morning, Emily's unease had only grown. With dark circles under her eyes, she decided to distract herself by exploring the house further. In a forgotten corner of the dining room, she stumbled across a trunk filled with old photographs and letters. The images were haunting, stern-faced ancestors glaring into the lens, their gazes sharp enough to pierce through time. But it was the letters that unraveled the story, a tale of betrayal, jealousy, and violence, culminating in the disappearance of a family member none of the letters dared mention by name. "Beware the shadow," one letter warned cryptically, ink smeared as though the writer's hand had trembled. As Emily read further, goosebumps prickled her skin. The shadow was tied to the attic, a place that even years ago was avoided with superstitious dread. When she spoke to the locals later, her suspicions deepened. An elderly shopkeeper narrowed his eyes at her mention of the house. "That attic," he muttered. "Things happened up there. Dark things." That night, the unease in the house escalated. The sounds from the attic grew louder, more insistent. Footsteps traveled the length of the attic, heavier this time, as if someone or something was pacing angrily above her. Emily sat rigid in the living room, clutching a shaky cup of tea. The shadows around her danced as if alive, and for a moment, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a dark, amorphous figure lingering near the attic door. It disappeared when she turned her head, leaving the spot suffused in unnatural cold. Her fear paralyzed her, yet her curiosity burned brighter. Who was this shadow? Why was it here? And what did it want from her? Unable to bear the silence and dread any longer, Emily reached out to a local historian who had studied the area's history. Meeting at the local library, the historian revealed the full tale of the mansion's cursed occupants. The house had belonged to the Astor family, plagued by infighting and tragedy. In the late 1800s, one member, a woman named Lillian, had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Rumors hinted at murder, jealousy over an inheritance, and worst of all, a shadow that seemed to grow darker with her disappearance. "It's said the shadow isn't just a memory or a ghost," the historian explained, "but a manifestation of guilt and fear, a darkness tied to unresolved betrayal." The attic, it seemed, was ground zero for the curse. His warning chilled Emily to her core. The shadow feeds on fear. You can't run from it. That night, Emily resolved to confront whatever was in the attic. Equipped with a flashlight and a growing sense of desperation, she approached the creaking stairs leading up to the attic door. The closer she got, the colder the air became, wrapping around her like icy fingers. But just as her fingers grazed the doorknob, there was a deafening thud on the other side. She stumbled back, her courage crumbling as the shadow's presence seemed to seep through the cracks of the door itself. The house reverberated with an unnatural groan, as though urging her to leave. Instead, Emily retreated to the safety of her bedroom, deciding to return when she felt braver. but it became clear there was no safety to be found. The shadow had begun following her. She saw it now, even outside the attic, a flicker of darkness in the corner of her eye, an oppressive chill that crept into rooms it never did before. Days passed, and Emily felt herself unraveling. The shadow grew bolder, brushing past her shoulder as she moved through the hallways, whispering unintelligible words in the dead of night. She knew she couldn't avoid it much longer. Summoning every ounce of bravery she had, Emily descended into the basement to retrieve an old wooden chest she had discovered earlier. Inside, she found a twisted symbol carved into a weathered plank, an object she hoped would give her some protection. Carrying it in trembling hands, she climbed the rickety steps to the attic. The door groaned open, revealing darkness so thick it pulsed. Emily shined her flashlight, but its beam seemed to dissolve into the blackness. Then she saw it, the shadow, no longer a fleeting figure but a fully formed presence. Its hollow shape bled into the walls, its eyeless gaze locked on her. The shadow surged toward her, invading her thoughts with flashes of the past, betrayal, jealousy, and finally Lillian, her terrified face as the attic consumed her. This wasn't just a ghost, it was the mansion itself, alive, harboring the remnants of every cruel act that had occurred within its walls. Emily's hands tightened around the carved plank. Instead of fear, a sudden rage filled her. If the shadow fed on her emotions, she would starve it. "You don't own me," she whispered, the timbre of her voice growing louder with each word. The shadow hesitated, its form rippling as her defiance weakened its hold. Emily threw the plank to the ground, shattering it, and suddenly, the oppressive air lifted. The attic's oppressive energy dissipated, leaving the room still and cold. Emily stayed frozen for a moment, her heart thundering in her chest. The shadow had retreated, but had it truly gone, or was it merely dormant, biding its time? In the days that followed, the house grew quieter. The chilling draft was gone, and the attic returned to its state of decayed normalcy. Emily, exhausted but strangely at peace, began sorting through her family's artifacts with a newfound clarity. But in the quiet corners of the mansion, the shadows still seemed to pulse and flicker, just out of reach. Months later, Emily sold the house, leaving behind the cursed legacy that had ensnared her family for generations. As she handed over the keys to its new owner, she hesitated, wondering if she should explain the truth. She chose silence instead. Driving away, she glanced back one last time. The house stood motionless in the distance, but in the attic window, a faint, dark shape lingered, staring back at her. The shadow still lived, waiting, watching, ready to feed again. And deep down, Emily knew its story was far from over.